the way that you are training and learning is wrong. Most people are learning and training through methods that are either handed down to them through practitioner communities, which is all good, well and good, but there has been a lot of changes and advents in research in neuroscience, specifically with motor learning and how our brains work and how we actually learn and how those neural connections are created and then they're strengthened. And this has been maybe a couple decades of research. And specifically, there's been a lot of advents in like neural imaging where we can actually see physically what's happening in our brain. We're able to actually observe it. So I didn't know any of this either, and most people don't. So I've spent the past couple months really sitting down and figuring this stuff out. I'll actually show you up on the screen real quick. There's this cool site called Research Rabbit, and it lets you do, among other things, put together all of the scientific journals that get collected and kind of create webs of similar work that you can look up. So it's pretty neat. I've been using this for a little while now to kind of validate everything that I've been researching. And so there's a lot of different sources of information out there. Andrew Huberman is probably the most common one that people are familiar with. I've seen it a lot in the AIM community. I've been consuming his podcast a lot. He is an actual neuroscientist. He's a teacher at, he's a professor. He's got a PhD in ophthalmology and neuroscience. Fantastic podcast. He does a really good job of breaking down scientific and highly technical and mechanical concepts, and then helping them, help you, the layman, me, the layman, understand them, but then also create protocols. In other words, procedures that you can actually implement in your own life to make these things effective based on how these biological things work. So me, I'm an applied scientist. I do work for an educational institution. I won't say which one. I'm an engineer. I'm not a neuroscientist by any stretch of the imagination. I don't even work in biosciences. I do have a scientific researcher in my title, just because I work for an educational institution. That's how it works. So I just want to make it clear up front, I'm not an expert in this. I've been doing the very best I can to kind of coalesce all of this into a meaningful narrative, which we're going to get into. I'm going to get some things wrong, but hopefully I'm able to. One thing that I've learned over the years that I'm pretty good at is taking complex topics and then breaking them down into the core components and then describing that to other people. So, one thing that I think is very important that I noticed in the AIM community specifically, this applies to just about anything, I'm sure, but people have a tendency to take scientific research that's unpublished, or stuff that comes from maybe like a graduate student that is doing their master's or their PhD thesis, and then they publish that, and then they use that as a basis to form their opinions. I want to make it very clear up front, I'm not doing that. I am only looking at apex journals like Journal Science, Neuron, things like that are major journals that have been peer reviewed. And also I think it's very important of the quality of research, things like looking for things that are placebo controlled, they have human trials, double blind where possible. Things like that is what I really look for when I'm pulling together my research. So this isn't just some random thing that somebody put together that has actually no validity. This is stuff that has been corroborated. So I think all of those things are very important. And so what I want to talk about really quickly before I start is the format. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to describe all of these underlying mechanisms, and these are biological mechanisms. And the way you can think of these are features of how we're built as humans. In other words, they're very factual. This is just like how our biology works. And then later on, what I'm going to do is describe the protocols. And so why I think that's very important is because there's two things that I think are important there. One is it's more likely that you're going to stick to a protocol or, like a training regimen, for example, if you understand why it works. At least that's the way that I work. And the second thing is you can customize it. That's one thing that I've noticed a lot is people will try to use somebody else's protocols verbatim without understanding why they work. And then when they don't work for them, they either don't know what to do or they don't know how to modify it based on why that person originally created it. So that's why I'm going to talk about those two things distinctly. And this is not going to be a detailed dive on the studies for time purposes because it would just take forever. Like I said, I would strongly suggest, if you are interested in this, to start with the Andrew Huberman podcast. It's fantastic. It does a really good job of breaking this down in a very technical manner. This is going to be a 1 hour session. I think this one's going to go a little bit longer because I got to do the intro like I'm doing right now. And then, so 45 minutes and then 15-minute question at the end. So hold your questions to the end. And I would ask that, use clips. That helps me if you clip something that if it resonates with you. And then if you want to share that, that'll help me out. So let's just get started. And this is my web that I have just been putting together. All right, this is stuff that I started putting together in an actual narrative. But then I said, you know what? I'm just going to off the cuff it. So that's what we're going to do. So I highlighted pink the two things that I think that we should talk about first. The first thing being, what is the nervous system? So instead of describing it, I pulled up, an image of a nervous system. This is your brain, and then you have all of these nerves that are going throughout your body, and your brain controls all of your thoughts, all of your behaviors, all of your emotions, all of your biological urges, like sexual arousal, except for the virgins out there, which I'm sure there are many of you. We got to keep this a little light. Your digestion, your heartbeat, all of that is controlled by your brain. Okay, so like when we're thinking of a nervous system, you're thinking of your brain and then all of the neurons and the nerves and the neural connections that control your entire body. Okay. Yeah, this is going to be just like a 101 neuroscience lecture. I'm going to put somebody in timeout. Okay, so what is a motor skill? A motor skill is literally anything that you do that involves the physical movement of your limbs. Anything. So in our context, we're thinking of a motor skill as aim training. But it could be running, it could be riding a bike, it could be doing jujitsu, anything. Anything that involves a movement of your limb, playing golf, playing basketball. More or less, your body kind of evolved, your brain and your body evolved to take thought and then turn that into action. So the majority of your brain and body and nervous system is built to move toward that end, okay? So the important thing to note is the way that we're going to describe all of these technical processes that you can see right here, all these definitions. But the important thing to note is that they're universal, regardless of which motor skill that you're performing. They're all relevant. All of these mechanisms work the same. So the way that your brain learns aim and aim training is not different at all from the way that your brain learns weightlifting or karate or speed typing or cooking. Like those are all, it's completely universal. So I want to talk about plasticity. Plasticity is this incredible feature that our brains have that allows the brain to reshape itself based on our experiences. Okay. And this is a topic that people in particular that are older would probably be most interested in. Anybody over the age of 25, that's kind of like how I came across it, is when you were older. So when you're young, essentially, your brain is very plastic. And what that means is it is able to be changed very easily. There's a lot of biochemicals that are sloshing around in your brain. You're moving around a lot. Your vestibular system, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, is constantly being engaged. So you just learn things very quickly. And this is by design. Like, essentially, the way that we work, the way that human beings work, is we're supposed to learn. After you're born, you're just like a little baby, and you just go like this. Like, you can't actually defend yourself. You can't eat. You can't do anything. You can't even change your own diaper. Over time, you have to learn how to do those things so that you can survive, if for no other reason. Then once you get to about the age 25, and it's not exactly 25, that starts to taper off. There's a tapering off period before that, and then it tapers off after that. So a lot of people think, okay, and so by that I mean, this is what I had this note. It's more passive when you're younger, and by that I mean, it's not as though you can't. It's not as though you can learn just by doing nothing. You have to actually be engaging in the behaviors. It's just way easier when you're younger, when you're under the age of 25, to pick up new skills and acquire them without having to specifically engage neuroplasticity. So you can think of neuroplasticity as a set of gates that need to be opened, so to speak. And then once they're open, then you are way more likely to take in that information. So, and this just happens more passively at a younger age. So some of the criteria that's very important, we'll talk about all of it, but some of the criteria that's very important is that in order for your brain to recognize that it needs to change, something needs to be novel. And what do we mean by novel? That means different or interesting or new. So, and, people that are familiar with marketing or like advertising are probably familiar with, the idea of novelty. People don't remember things when it's the same. You are way more likely to remember something when it's different. You notice it, right? Like if you think of the scene of the Matrix, the lady in the red dress, and then, Neo turns his head. Of course he does, because he sees, all of these normal people just walking around, and all of a sudden there's this lady in the red dress. It's novel. It's the same, that's how our brains are built. So a lot of the mechanisms that we use to engage neuroplasticity are centered around the idea that we want things to be different in order to learn them, okay? Another key criteria is errors. This is something anybody who's been following me for a little while knows. I talk a lot about errors. Errors are one of the main mechanisms by which your brain is cued that something is off and something needs to change. We'll talk about the specific neurochemicals associated with that, but error creation is one of the most important concepts with learning and improving and getting better. So a lot of the protocols that we're going to talk about are actually going to be centered around the idea of creating errors. And it's one of those things where it seems obvious, but it's also more intuitive. Well, if you create more errors, you're just going to learn the wrong things. You're going to develop bad habits. That's something that you hear a lot of people say. And coaches, might encourage people to make less errors. And it turns out that, and we'll talk about why this is, that error creation is actually extremely important for developing skills and learning and improving your memory. One key thing that I want to talk about with neuroplasticity, this just kind of like set at home with me, is they have actually done neural imaging studies where they have stimulated the specific brain regions and cause neurochemicals to get released, and then they were able to observe neural connections being made when those conditions were met. So to me, the most important thing to get from that is neuroplasticity has to happen when these conditions are met, meaning you will learn when you do a certain set of gated things, which we're going to talk about. It's a feature of human beings. And that's why I said at the beginning, forgot what I said at the beginning, that was important, but whatever. The other thing I want to mention is that the rate and magnitude that you learn is gated by your desire or need. So what does that mean? That means that the more important that something is to you, the more likely you are going to learn it. And I know that sounds like obvious, but it didn't have to be that way. And a lot of times people, when they're training, they don't associate something very important with them, and then they are less likely to learn things. So, and the thing that also I associate with that is trauma and major events. When something traumatic happens to us, we remember it very quickly. So like, let's say that you're held at gunpoint. I hate that analogy, but if you are, you're going to remember that moment for a very long time. Not only that, but you'll learn very quickly, and your brain is going to be on the lookout for that. So that's part of the concept with how we learn things, is that it's based around survival. So when very novel things happen to us, whether positive or negative, it could be like the birth of your child, a lot of biochemicals are released all at once. Adrenaline, norepinephrine, we're going to talk about this. Adrenaline, acetylcholine, dopamine, these are the major ones. And that causes neural connections to be connected and established very quickly, and it causes a lasting memory. So by engaging it, by making something important to us, because our brain doesn't know that something is important to us. It doesn't recognize emotion. It recognizes when the biochemicals release. When something's important to us and it needs, like we have some, heavy desire to change, that releases the biochemicals that are associated with learning. Okay. And it could, and that's why I mention it in the term of trauma or major events, because those are the types of things that happen, that trigger, that create memories for us that are not driven by some kind of motivation, but we can engage those same mechanisms to allow ourselves to learn. Okay. Those are the main things that I want to talk about with neuroplasticity. The last thing I will mention is that when we engage the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, we leave a milieu. And a milieu is essentially, I think it's a French term for environment. So we create an environment of learning. We, in the AIM community, want to learn a motor skill. So this doesn't really apply to us, but like, let's say you wanted to learn conversational French. If you engage the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, and of which a lot of them are related to doing motor skills, you could then start doing something else, like studying or learning French that's not a motor skill, and you will have an increased rate of learning. Okay, so I think this is the most interesting thing to me, is that human beings essentially evolved to need to move around and to do motor skills in order to learn. Like, those are the mechanisms that we engage to learn. And this is why I think you notice a lot of people that are really good at motor skills also happen to be kind of athletic, and they happen to move around a lot. Even if they don't invest as much time, like if somebody sits at the PC and they're a gremlin 12 hours a day and they never move around, and then they've got this dude that maybe spends half the amount of time on PCs, but they're still better because they're out and they're moving around. They're engaging the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, which allows them to learn and improve at a faster rate than somebody who's just sitting there being a gremlin all day. Okay. I know this is crazy stuff. This is stuff that's been floating around in my brain for a very long time. So I'm really glad I finally got to talk about all of this. So let's talk about definitions. How am I in time? All right, I think I'll cut it about top of the hour, and I'll switch over to questions. So, what are the important parts that we care about for motor learning? So there's 3 main components to all motor skill control. Okay. The first one is your upper motor neurons. And your upper motor neurons, as the name implies, are kind of near the top of your brain. I don't know the exact brain regions. If you want to know, you can find out. And these are more associated with intentional thought and when you want to perform deliberate behaviors. So for example, if, I said, hey, can you pick up that glass and then pour it out? That would be engaging more so your upper motor neurons. The act of you reaching out and picking up the glass might not be, because that's something that's more reflexive, which means it's more automatic for you. It's something that you can just kind of do. And the interesting thing to me is there are, motor actions that are not associated with the upper motor neurons, meaning they're more reflexive, so they'll be more in your lower motor neurons, like walking, for example. But you can actively think about walking. Like if you just get up and walk, you'll just do it. But if you think about doing 2 steps forward and then two steps back, or 2 and 2 instead of your normal 1 and 1, like you're going to start using your upper motor neurons to do that, because it is now more of a deliberate action. Okay. So, and then you've got your central pattern generators, also known as CPGs. These are probably some of the more interesting research that has happened over the past couple decades. They actually did a lot of barbaric experiments back in the day to kind of discover these with like cats and dogs, by taking out like entire regions of their brain and then discovering that they would still do locomotive type motion. But so central pattern generators are when you perform behaviors repetitively over time, they tend to get offloaded, especially if they have some kind of like tempo associated with them, or some kind of like locomotion. So like you're walking, you're running, swimming, even maybe like a golf swing or a tennis swing, because you've done it so many times and it has like a specific pattern that you follow all the time, most of the time anyway. I would say even like clicking and static dots has very, maybe even tracking has distinct mechanisms where they're like patterns, and you kind of perform them reflexively as you learn them. So this is where those behaviors and like encoding is stored in your central pattern generators. And then you've got your lower motor neurons, and your lower motor neurons, as it indicates, are the closest to your actual muscles. And so your lower motor neurons live in your spine, and then they connect to your muscles using axons, which is a cool little term. And they actually engage the muscles, and they send little electrical signals, and then they twitch. So as I'm doing this little thing, my lower motor neurons are talking to my muscles, and they're saying, hey, do your fingers in a wavy pattern. But the lower motor neurons themselves are more like, the way Huberman describes them, they're like obedient soldiers. They just do what they're told. There's no real like encoding, so to speak. It's just they just fire, and they fire based on the information that is being handed to them by your upper motor neurons and your central pattern generators. So good way to think of it is your upper motor neurons talk to your central pattern generators and your lower motor neurons. And that is a 101 neuroscience course, essentially, if you just went to college. So fun times. So let's talk about muscle memory. In the AIM community specifically, muscle memory has always been a really divisive topic. Now, there's the easily discardable philosophy of muscle memory is the one that your muscles themselves store information, that is where reflexive or automatic behaviors are executed. And as I just described, that is obviously not the case. Your muscles don't have any information. They're just muscles. Your neurons are the ones that have the information. So neural memory is a more likely, and I think a more apt way to describe this topic. It's neural memory. And the idea of the fact that behavior becomes reflexive over time, meaning it becomes more automatic, where it starts in your upper motor neurons when you're first learning a skill, and then it starts to get offloaded into your central pattern generators and your lower motor neurons. That is true. It's just, I think it's a poor way to describe it when you call it muscle memory, because of what we described before. It gives the idea that encoding happens directly in your muscles, which isn't true. So, and the third most divisive, I guess, topic is when people talk about, trying to keep things the same all the time in order to learn better. That, as I described before, and I'll talk about in more detail, is not true because of this guy. You need errors and you need novelty to learn. If you keep things the same all the time, you'll never learn because your brain isn't cued that something needs to change. Your brain wants to use as little energy. It wants to be efficient with what it knows how to do, and you continuing to do the same things all the time is actually going to lead to you not improving and not learning. So hopefully that puts it to rest. I really doubt it ever will, but I think if we just call it neural memory or something, then, well, I'll just get along a lot better. Okay. We got 35 minutes. I hope I can get through all the definitions in this sitting. So let's talk about neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters, these are these fun little objects. They're cellular structures that exist in your brain, and their job is to deploy and regulate the deployment of neurochemicals. Neurochemicals, for lack of a better term, are basically drugs. And they use these neurochemicals to activate and deactivate and essentially control your neural circuits. So the way that things change and happen in your brain whenever you are doing anything, really, the way that those behaviors are being engaged is through the release and regulation of neurochemicals. There's quite a few. We're gonna talk mostly about dopamine, epinephrine, and acetylcholine. I'm gonna talk about each one of those in detail. There are others, there's like cortisol, which is like stress. There's like serotonin. There's a bunch, but the ones that we care about that are most related to motor activity are the three that I mentioned. Again, the important thing to remember is that all of your behavior is controlled through the release and regulation of these neurochemicals. So a lot of the protocols that we're going to be working on is going to be based around the timing and the release and when and how these neurochemicals are engaged, how the release, how much of it. And to that end, I can talk about this when we get to dopamine specifically, but one of the very important concepts that I find through all of the different types of releases of neurochemicals is a signal to noise. By that, I mean, if there is too much of any one thing, then your brain is unable to make a connection. All of these things have to kind of like work together in harmony, like a Goldilocks type thing. Like if you have a shit ton of dopamine, then you're going to be, super in a mode of like reward and like motivation, but you won't know what to pay attention to. So it is unable to make a connection of what to pay attention to because you're just like swimming with, the idea of reward and motivation. And we'll talk about that more in detail, but that's something I just want to mention right now. So actually, let's just talk about dopamine. So most people are familiar with dopamine. Most people are familiar with dopamine as a pleasure chemical, because it is definitely a chemical that's deployed when you are, rewarded with something, or when you eat sugary foods, for example, or smoke a cigarette, or after you have sex. Again, most of you are virgins, so you wouldn't know what that's like, I'm sure. But one of the other important concepts with dopamine is it's associated with motivation. Okay, so like getting to a state where you want to perform a behavior, dopamine is involved. And one of the really cool things is that a lot of people aren't familiar with is, so dopamine has these two different mechanisms, D1 and D2 pathways is what they call them. So it is not only associated with being engaged when you want to perform something, but it's also when you don't want to perform something. So D1, D2, they call it go and no go. So if you think of a time when you want to restrain yourself. Like, let's say that, somebody says something that pisses you off, but it's not the right time or place to say something, and it's just going to make things worse. Dopamine would be involved with, preventing you from like saying something or like starting a fight or whatever you're going to do. Okay. So, the other thing I'll mention is that dopamine is released biologically. It's connected with, there's some things that are hardwired into all of us that dopamine is involved with, like food, for example, shelter. There's, these hardwired things that all of us will understand, like everybody knows about the idea of having like a gathering and there being a lot of food. Everybody has a good time. There's a lot of dopamine involved. But other than that, it's contextual. So the more authentic something is for you, the more that you can attach dopamine to some behavior that you want to perform or that you want to reward or some kind of motivation that you want to create. It's going to be different for everybody. If somebody is like doing 1 while 6 targets and they're getting like a 750 and that's the best they've ever gotten, like that's going to have a huge spike of dopamine for somebody. But for somebody else, that's nothing. It's not going to mean anything to them. So acetylcholine, this is one that is starting to get a lot more attention because of like alpha GPC, and there's nootropics that are starting to get attention. So acetylcholine is associated with focus and attention. That is the most important thing, and the way that I understand this in my head is it's associated with narrowing your focus on something. Like if you think of, I'll even use this as an example. Like let's say that I zoom out on this, right? You got a lot of stuff going on, like, and I tell you, hey, like, check out the supplements card. And you're going to be like, what? Like, where's that? Because there's a ton of cards all over the place. So you've got a big focus, you've got a big, whatever, FOV for lack of a better term. But then if I go and target it specifically, and then I say, hey, it's right here. Now I have increased the focus and now it's visible and it's, okay, I found it, right? So I think of acetylcholine in a very similar concept, very similar context. In order for your brain to understand that what needs to change, acetylcholine is involved with focusing and narrowing your focus on the thing that needs to change, okay? And the other thing that I want to mention with this is it's associated with marking the correct motor patterns for change. And those motor patterns and those neural connections that change happen, those changes happen during deep rest, okay? So something that I've seen a lot of people say is like, oh, you need to train right before bed because that's when you're, when you actually make the connections when they strengthen. That's not true, because what is happening when there is acetylcholine involved, when there's focus, there's attention involved, they're marking them for change, which happens during deep rest. They still change when you do have deep rest. It doesn't matter when that is. And then the last one we care about is norepinephrine. So you see, I'm sure there's differences between norepinephrine and epinephrine, but I always see it kind of used interchangeably with adrenaline. And most people know what adrenaline is because adrenaline is that feeling that you feel when you're excited. And so this is associated with alertness. So getting into something, just like dopamine is involved, being alert. And so alert and focused. I mean, again, acetylcholine is involved with focus, but you see how they're all kind of intertwined. And the other thing that is really interesting is that adrenaline is involved with stamping in memories. And it's there's a ton of, we're talking decades of research by this one guy. I think his name is McGaw. Reviews since like the 70s, where they have been systematically trying to dissect what causes memories to be formed and what with less repetitions and what causes them to be long term. Like in other words, like why we select certain memories over others, and why those memories are retained for longer periods of time. And the one thing that they were able to find, like through tons of trial and error and, you know, blocking adrenaline and spiking adrenaline, et cetera, was adrenaline. So the big reason why you remember things is due to spikes in adrenaline. So part of the protocols that we're going to be talking about involves increasing adrenaline at the right times so that you are more likely to remember the thing that you're trying to remember, which for most of you is going to be aim training. Okay. So let's talk about closed loop and open loop. There's two main types of motor behaviors for us, because we're talking about aim training. The ones that we're mostly going to be thinking about is actually going to be open loop, because you get fast feedback, but there's open loop and then closed loop. So open loop is when you get fast feedback from performing a behavior, and feedback is an important part of how you learn, basically, by the way. So open loop is like a fast feedback. So if you think of like throwing a dart, or like hitting a golf ball, or hitting a tennis ball, or shooting a dot on a screen, you know, like a static dot, for example, like once you get near immediate or very fast feedback on whether or not you performed that motor behavior correctly, that's open loop. Closed loop is more like slow and methodical. So it's like, it was more like what we were talking about with the central pattern generators. It's like running and swimming. It's something that where you're performing, or like rowing, like it's like a tempo almost, like, and you don't really get that feedback of how you're performing, other than if you're like hitting a pace, essentially. So for the most part, everything that we do in aim training is going to be open loop. I thought about how tracking might be closed loop, but I still don't think it's just, I don't think so, because each bullet that's hitting is you get feedback on whether or not you're hitting it. But it does matter more when you start thinking about something like dancing, or where like what you pay attention to basically is where that matters. So it doesn't really matter much in our context, but I just wanted to mention it in case you find it while you're doing research on this on your own. Then you're like, hey, this stuff matters. Let's talk about NSDR and consolidation. So NSDR is a fancy term for non-sleep deep rest, which also just really means anytime that you're getting rest where you're not sleeping. So one of the most common ways that people can achieve this is through meditation. There is decades of, just plethora of fantastic research with the benefits of meditation. So there's this doctor, her name's Dr. Wendy Suzuki, I believe, and she is one of the premier doctors in the field for memory, specifically with the hippocampus, which is where your short-term memories are stored. Short-term can be very long. It can be like 4 years or more. But she says that she lists meditation as one of the most important behaviors that you can engage in, along with cardio and getting sleep. That's how important she views it. So what is so important about NSDR is the way that we retain memories and the way that our brain assembles motor behaviors or any behaviors that we're performing is through this concept called consolidation. So, and if you look up consolidation, you'll find a ton of information about it. And what happens during consolidation is your brain will replay the motor behaviors that you've engaged in, and those, remember when I talked about acetylcholine and the focus attention and marking the correct patterns, it will consolidate those correct patterns and then store them and strengthen them for long-term use. So that's why NSDR is a vital part, and getting good rest is a vital part of improving, because that's the time that your brain sorts through all the shit that you just did for the past day or past few hours, and then it figures out, oh, those are the correct behaviors, those are the correct behaviors, and then it stamps them in and makes them automatic. This is like think of it as like the trial and error mechanism that your brain starts to approximate the correct motor patterns, right? And it does that because when you're performing a skill, like if you're performing free throws, for example, it doesn't know that you need to get the ball in the hoop. It doesn't give a shit. It doesn't know that you're even playing basketball. It doesn't understand the concept of basketball. It knows that is the correct behavior because when you eventually get the ball in the hoop after however many trials, your brain releases dopamine. And it knows that you're focusing really hard because your brain's releasing acetylcholine. And it knows that you finally got it because your brain releases adrenaline along with dopamine when you get it in place. And then so it marks those connections. It says, aha, the motor behavior that he was performing at this time, these are the neural connections that were in place. These were the muscles that were being engaged. These were the lower motor neurons. And then it stamps those and it marks them. And then when you sleep in NSDR, that's when all that stuff is consolidated, it's replayed, and it's strengthened. Okay? So that's how this whole thing kind of comes together. Your brain it's not dumb, but for lack of a better term, we humans have given meaning to things like sports and, emotions like love and, winning and competition, but it doesn't care about all of that. It just cares about these biochemicals that are getting deployed and that it knows that it needs to change, right? So, let's see. Sorry, my nose itches today. I get bad allergies. So we'll talk about flow last. Let's talk about circadian rhythms a little bit. Circadian rhythms, I'm not going to talk too much about circadian rhythms in this series, but a lot of people will find this stuff on their own, and we'll talk about it a little bit. But circadian rhythms is essentially the way that your brain and your body understands time is through a circadian rhythm. And interestingly enough, the way that our biology is wired to perceive time is through the viewing of sunlight. So it's kind of nutty, but we have these, not only our eyes are for vision, but it's also for perceiving time. We have these things called melanopsin cells. They were recently discovered as of 5 or 6 years ago. Melanopsin cells that their job is to perceive the angle and the type of blue light that's coming from the sun, basically when it's rising. So it uses that as its basis to set a circadian clock. And that's how all of your cells and stuff, they have all these normal cycles that they go through, just like you have a normal cycle that you go through where you're more awake and alert, and when you're more tired and kind of winding down. That's how your brain and body recognizes that cycle, is through the viewing of the sun. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is, I'll just touch on it because it's not really related to motor learning, but it is related to getting sleep. Good sleep is viewing the sun within the first hour of waking for about 2 to 10 minutes, which is what starts your circadian clock. And then also doing it in the evening time when the sun's going down, so that it's seeing the angle of the sun going down and the different types of light that your eyes get. So it's kind of crazy. And we're basically just really well programmed AI, guys. That's what it comes down to. And this is how. And we're kind of over time, learning how we were programmed, We're going through all the code and trying to figure that shit out. So the last thing that I'll mention is flow. Flow state. Flow state is something that you always hear in the AIM community. And it's popular in a lot of different disciplines. It's popular in software development because everybody kind of wants to achieve this, this feeling where they can accomplish a lot in a small amount of time. There's, this 1 to 2 hours in your day where you're highly productive. And if you can engage that, then you can get your 8 hours of work that you would normally be doing in that short amount of time because you're just optimizing your day. So the one thing I will say that is flow is it's a philosophical thing, and it's an expression of what you already know. It's not the way that you would try to learn something new or to improve a skill. the way that you do improve the skill is what we're going to be talking about next. And I'm probably not going to get to it obviously in this, but it's going to, all these types of protocols that we're going to talk about. So I'm not anti-flow. I think it's, and some of the concepts are kind of related because it's this, ideal zone where you're like frustrated, but you're not too frustrated, which is important. And we're going to talk about frustration and why that's important to learn. So there's kind of some related concepts, but again, it's an expression of what you already know. It's not the way that you learn new things. So in the last thing I'll talk about, and then we'll switch it over to questions. I'm glad I set this for an hour because this shit is, this is a lot harder to talk about than I thought it was going to be. Is your maps of space. So what your brain does is, in your brain, it creates maps of all of your experiences. Your experiences of the visual world, your auditory world, your motor space. So like reaching out to this glass, picking it up. I know when I reach my hand out and I go to grab that glass, it is going to be on target. I'm not going to miss. I'm going to hit it. That's a map of motor space. And then there's this other space that I didn't talk about yet because it's not really related to us in AIM community anyway, is proprioceptive. And that's a very technical term, but it essentially means you know where your limbs are even if you can't see them. So like if you do like a back kick or something and you've been practicing karate, you could probably hit your target without actually being able to see your limb, and you know where it is. You don't really bump into walls and shit because you kind of know where your limbs are in relation to where your body is. And the thing, why is that important? The thing that I will say that is kind of important. So first of all, the way that you learn is by creating mismatches in your current understanding of your map of space. So when something is off, that's how your brain knows that triggers that something needs to change. And we do that through errors primarily, which we're going to talk about in the next episode. But the other thing that I think is kind of cool and important is that all of your maps of space are connected. I wish I could remember the freaking name of the brain region that does it. It's like corpus callosum or something, but it essentially is the mechanism by which we can know where something is and we can attune to it visually, for example, just by hearing it. So if like a dog just like barked behind me to my left, I would know exactly where to look. I would be like, oh shit, there's a dog back there, because all of those maps of space are connected. So I think that's kind of neat. I think I got through everything. Woo. Yeah, I do a lot of training in my real job. I think I can talk about. Actually, yeah, let's talk about this, and then we'll switch it over to questions. So, how do behaviors become reflexive? And what do I mean by reflexive? And I think I said this before, but reflexive just means it's automatic. And so we talked about the brain regions that are involved. Your upper motor neurons is where your more intentional, deliberate behaviors happen, things that you need to actively think about in order to perform. They become reflexive, as I mentioned before, primarily through repetition. So like the first time that you make a cup of coffee, it might take you a little while as you figure out like how to grind the beans and plug it in. And okay, what does this little carafe do? Where do I put that? By the 300th time that you've done that, it gets offloaded more to your central pattern generators and your lower motor neurons. You could probably make a cup of coffee like while you're half asleep still, and your boss is yelling at you on the phone because you're late, and you're actually focusing on that, but you look down and you're like, oh shit, I've got a cup of coffee. You didn't even realize that you did it. It's become a lot more automatic at that point because you've done it so many times. So repeat behavior is a big part of it. It seems obvious, but that's true. The thing that I mentioned this before, but our brains kind of evolved to turn thought into action. So I didn't talk about this, but there's two main parts of your brain, two main networks. You've got your task-oriented network and your default mode network. And your task-oriented network is where all of these things that we've been talking about more or less resides. because your brain is really built to do things like dopamine and stuff like that is like we're constantly trying to figure out how to be better, how to improve. Your default mode networks is more like, okay, when you're just sitting there not doing anything, like you're just letting thoughts pass. You're not on your phone, you're not playing a game, you're not doing anything. Like that's when your default mode network is engaged, and that's really where the NSDR type stuff comes into play. And I think of it as like an energy optimization thing. Like your brain wants to do less work. Like your upper motor neurons doesn't want to have to do everything. Like, and it doesn't make sense that if you're doing something repetitively, if you're getting in a car all the time and then you're putting in the first and you're, hitting the gas pedal and the brake pedal, like why would it want to have to think about that intentionally every single time that you do it? It wants to offload that into parts of your brain where it takes less effort in order to achieve it. And then it starts to lock those things in as being, an expected outcome. So that's why in order to learn, we have to focus so much on doing something that's novel, and why it's so focused around creating errors in a mismatch of the space. Okay, I'm done talking. That was fun. So let's kick it over to questions, and I can see, I'll just start going with I see Vading say, do you know if neuroatypical conditions like autism affect these mechanics? I don't know as much about autism. I will say that there's a lot of information about ADHD in particular. And so the way that our normal brains work, people that don't have ADHD, I should say, I don't mean that in a negative way at all. Our brains are anti-correlated. So what that means is when your default mode network is engaged, then your task-oriented network isn't, and vice versa. So, and the way that those two networks are regulated is through dopamine. And so people that have ADHD usually have issues with getting proper amounts of dopamine regulation. So that's why, they tend to find it difficult to sit still for long periods of time or stay on task, because they're just like constantly switching back between those two networks. And that's why, like I mentioned before, kind of doing some amount of NSDR, non-sleep deep rest is important, because your brain needs like rest from doing tasks, and it needs time to consolidate that information. So I could see something similar being true for people that have autism. I don't exactly know what those mechanisms are, but I would definitely imagine that that's the case. You said novel and errors are important to learn a motor skill. So is that why randomized scenarios are good, because it's different and random? I would say yes. We're going to talk about that in more detail with like different protocols. There is some amount of, focus, especially if you're novice to intermediate. There's some amount of performing repetitions, just performing the repetitions and focusing on one thing that is important, at least until you start to become advanced. Because like I said before, if you're constantly changing things, then your brain doesn't know what to focus on that needs to change. So there's some amount of time that just needs to be dedicated to executing repetitions. If there's similar enough repetitions, then it doesn't really matter. But if you're like, if every single trial you're changing things around and you're focusing on something different, it can be negative, because then your brain doesn't know what to focus on and what it needs to make reflexive. Is new level helping my brain, or is it just, what the hell is new level? Is that like nootropic stuff? Should I leave questions on protocols for the next part? Yes. Do you think if you get really good and then stop training for like 5 years, you would go back to being a beginner? No. I would say there's going to be some amount of entropy, but I think that, it's been proven, like just without scientific research, that you retain, motor behaviors that you've developed for very long periods of time after you've developed them. How does this tie in with watching pros? We'll talk about that a little bit. watching pros. I think I would need to better understand what you mean by that. We'll talk more about like how to focus your attention, internal versus external focus. Focusing on the outcomes of the movement, the motor movement, versus focusing on how your physical limbs are oriented, and which one's superior. So that might be what you're getting at, but I'm not exactly sure. Please leave this listed. It's going to be listed. This is a bod. Starting ADHD medication. Nice. Do I ever speak about growth versus static mindsets? I think I'm trying to remember what that would most relate to. I mean, so I think I do specifically. Here we go. Yeah. So there's a part where I'm going to be talking about associating errors with the release of dopamine. So that's probably the closest that we're going to get to, because growth mindset is kind of like flow, where it's a philosophical concept. It's not necessarily a biological one. We're going to be talking about the biological one, but learning to associate errors with the release of dopamine and frustration with the release of dopamine is what I would consider, a growth mindset to be. It's like, effort for the sake of effort. You don't need a win or like some kind of competitive like outcome in order to feel like you're succeeding. If you can do that, then there's definitely a pronounced learning effect. It's a patented non-stimulant nutritional ingredient that boosts cognitive performance and energy in esports athletes. I want, at some point I want to do like, I think Rob, is probably the most qualified, but I want to do some like deep dive on all this nootropic stuff and like advanced.gg. And there's a lot of things I don't agree with when it comes to that, because they do a lot of pre-workout stuff and like caffeine and just crazy shit. When I aim train, I tend to listen to audiobooks. My initial thought was that it would simulate combining aim with game sense by splitting my focus in the actual. I don't necessarily think that was a necessary reason. Like, essentially, like if music or audiobooks or whatever helps you focus intentionally on performing the motor actions that you're performing, in this case, aim training, it's beneficial. If it distracts you, then it's not beneficial. That's really what it comes down to. New levels in advanced.gg. Oh my god. Thank you, Rocky, for buying me a beer. And I'm going to go grab some beers right after this, actually. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. Would taking a cold shower after aim training benefit aim? Yeah, so I'm going to deep dive on that. But yeah, spiking adrenaline after you are performing the behaviors that you want to learn is a way to stamp down what you just learned. And one way to spike adrenaline is by taking a cold shower. Crazy to think, but and it's funny because a lot of the research that they did to kind of figure out and isolate the fact that adrenaline is the thing that helps stamp in memory was literally by dunking the humans that they were doing the trials on, dunking their arm in ice cold water. That was how one of the mechanisms that they spiked adrenaline, and we're going to talk about that too later. Expand on the relevance of open versus closed loop with aim training. I personally don't think that it's very relevant. I just wanted to mention it because if anybody spends time going through the Huberman podcast, he specifically highlights this as like being an important thing that you need to focus on. But for the purposes of aim training, because everything is pretty much open loop, I don't think it matters. But if you want to use these techniques to improve at something like running or swimming, then it would be important, because then it helps you understand what you need to focus your attention on. I've geared this specifically at, what we need to focus on for attention for aim training just to like keep it simple and like remove any potential distractions. But if you wanted to use these techniques for learning something else, then you would need to think about that. Important to note that what you're learning depends on your understanding of the technique. I haven't totally been paying attention. I think is misunderstood is people optimize learning but not learning the right way to move a mouse, if that makes sense. Yeah, and so one of the things that I'm actually going to be talking about is like what's important to focus on depending on your skill level for that particular skill that you're trying to learn. And one of the things that is most important when you're first learning is dense reps, density of reps. And we'll talk about what that means specifically in the later protocol ones. But that is one of the most important things, especially when you're first learning a skill. And it does sort of evolve as you acquire like mastery and even virtuosity of a skill. But it's still some related concepts. What do you think about aim training fatigue, such as before bed? So if you are aim training when you're fatigued, and I'll talk about this later on with this concept called limbic friction. But you want to ideally get to a state of when you're about to engage in the skill learning where you are the most focused and alert and you're not too focused. There's like some kind of Goldilocks zone. So if you're kind of tired, you can expect that to be less optimal for you. How much does neuroplasticity decrease after 25? Is it like 20 to 30%, or is it more drastic? Yeah, I'll take questions for about 5 more minutes and then I'll close it. But I haven't seen specific measurements, but I have seen that the studies that they performed to discover this, they put lenses on. They gave lenses to different people in different age groups that skewed their vision and skewed their map of their motor space. So like it would like 20-30%, and so if they went to go reach out for a glass that was in front of them, it wasn't actually in front of them. And so younger people were able to adjust to that in like days, like very quickly, and some of the adults were never able to adjust to it. So it kind of varied, but just to give you an idea of like how stark of a difference it can be. But like I said, we are specifically going to be talking about which mechanisms we can use to open plasticity once you get past 25, and it's applicable to anybody. I haven't read The Inner Game of Tennis, but I'm sure it's quite useful. Do you think there's anything that can like help or boost your overall mentality? Is that more a personal thing? There's a lot of things like biologically you can do to improve your mood and motivation. Doing cardio on a regular basis, taking vitamin D, taking EPA and DHA, cold and warm exposure. Cold exposure has been shown to increase levels of dopamine for hours after the exposure. So there's quite a few things that you can do, like biologically. Could spaced... Oh, wait. How can I regain focus in a training session after getting fatigued? There's ways like breathing exercises. We're going to talk about that a little bit. There's ways that you can regain focus with breathing exercises. We're going to talk about one of the protocols is actually staring at a small dot for like a minute or two, which has scientific basis of helping to improve focus and attention, taking mini breaks. I thought the difference between younger and older than 27 is that younger people are basically always plastic and older. Right. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking, I bet. And the ways that we engage plasticity aren't like the most obvious things. Like one of the things is kind of upsetting your sense of balance, which sounds weird, but we'll talk about that. Okay, 205. Got the questions. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Like I said, I think I'm going to make this... I expect this to be probably 3 episodes long. It might be 4, though. So at the very end, what I want to do is, after going over all the mechanisms and going over all the protocols, I would just want to like summarize everything to make it very concrete of the protocols. And I'm sure that's going to be the most watched one, because then it's going to skip all the science and people just want to know how to do things. They don't want to understand why they work, but that's my plan. So I'll let you know. I'll just do the same thing. I'll like make a tweet and I'll make a YouTube post when I'm gonna do the next one, but it's probably going to be a couple weeks from now. So thank you for stopping by, everybody, and I'll see you next time.